My presentation is quite different in a way because it's about a very small research project. So I think we've heard a lot of wonderful stories about sort of big initiatives, and this is just one small project, which hopefully will add a bit of depth to the sort of things that we're talking about. Just briefly, what I'm going to cover is, I'm going to remind you, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of this, about what it means to be a carer of someone with dementia. Then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of theoretical background to peer support. And then I'll move on to the sort of details of our study, what we did, what we found, and the conclusions that we had. As you probably know, in the UK, 2/3 of the people living in the community with dementia are actually supported by their families. Now, families, we're generally talking this group we call carers. It's not necessarily the same people, but on the whole, I think for the moment, treat them as kind of synonymous. And what they do is they play an absolutely vital role and are normally the most important source of care for people. I mean, in the UK, for example, if you take carers in general, not carers of people with dementia, supposedly they say it save the economy 119 billion annually, which is more than the cost of the NHS. So this is, as I said, that's a figure for all carers, but it shows a huge amount of work that these people do. And we're always being told that we've got an ageing population, and we need to remember, okay, we're getting more people with dementia, but that also means we're getting more people who are taking up the role as a carer, and more of those people are older people when they're taking that role up. So it is a very important topic. Just a quick definition of what I mean by carer, just so that we know we're talking about the same thing. This is a English Department of Health definition. So it's somebody over 16 who provides a substantial amount of care on a regular basis to an adult or a disabled child. They may or may not be cohabiting, and they may or may not be a relative. But the key thing really is that they're not paid. So I'm not talking about paid care workers, as we call them in the UK. Now, we all know that carers provide an awful lot of support and that it is stressful. But I have a little hobby horse that we need to remember that many carers find their role very satisfying. And I think this comes out a little bit in the role of the peer supporter. And I think we're always talking about the negatives of being a carer, but actually, I think it's good to hang on to some of the satisfactions. We know that the carers of people with dementia often have poorer physical and emotional health than carers of other long-term conditions. So there seems to be something extra about being a carer of someone with dementia.
Excuse me. Could you speak up, please? It's a bit difficult to hear.
Okay, shall I try this one then? It's just it was. Is that better? Okay, sorry. So what we know that to be a carer of someone with dementia is probably more stressful than most other types of caring, with an effect on emotional and physical health. And we know that in general, being a carer leads to social isolation. But again, that is often worse for someone with caring for someone with dementia, because often there's a loss of relationship with the person with dementia. Families often find it very difficult. You get reduced social networks, and overlaid on that, you've got the stigma associated with dementia. So unlike something like stroke, where you have an acute event and people rush around, in dementia it's a gradual thing, but we do know that generally, the longer you're a carer, the smaller your social network becomes. So what do we mean by peer support? Well, it's often referred to as mentoring. And what I'm talking about today is support provided by what the theoretical people call as a similar other. And what we mean here is someone who's successfully faced similar situations can use that experience to create an empathetic relationship and can provide emotional and practical support. And importantly, for many people, hope for the future. So in this case, we're talking about someone who has been a carer of someone with dementia, not a carer in general, but a carer specifically of someone with dementia, who can offer guidance, sometimes practical, empathetic understanding, and can help carers adjust to their role. Now, we know there's some evidence from other kinds of caring that carers benefit from help with problem solving, information sharing, encouragement, and feedback. But actually, the information on carers, peer support for carers of people with dementia is very, very limited. My student Ray, second row back, and I did a systematic review, and really we ended up with 4 studies, didn't we, Ray, I think, out of I don't know, 4,000 hits on our... So there's very, very little. There is a little bit of quantitative evidence that suggests that you might reduce depression, for example, by peer support. But actually, it's very small. And what we need is qualitative research, is what I would say. But I think something, too, I want to kind of sell today is actually this is a two-sided relationship. What about the volunteers? Most of the research looks at the impact on the carer receiving the support. But what about these volunteers? And we know that, in general, volunteers have better physical health and emotional health. They report better well-being. They report better life satisfaction. And clearly, all these things overlap. But also, in fact, particularly for older people, they live longer as well. So what we wanted to do was actually try and do a double whammy and look at the experiences of both the carers receiving the support and these peer volunteers. Just a quick picture of our study team. Some of you may know Vari Drennan on the top right, my top right. She's done a lot on the Evidem project, and Mackenzie was also on the team. And then Ruth, who's there with her little son, did most of the interviewing in this. And we published it in the American Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and Other Dementias last year. So what about the support? Well, the service that we were looking at was in South London. It was one-to-one support from trained peer volunteers. And the first criteria was they had to be former carers of someone with dementia. And there was quite a thorough kind of screening process for the people they selected. And these carers and the volunteers met regularly. It was usually weekly, and it was usually for about an hour. And they were meant to stick to about a 6-week relationship. And in fact, what happened was most of it went on for much longer. But I think very importantly, the volunteers were received very comprehensive training. They had 3 days. It wasn't 3 days together, but spread out. 3 days of training. They had additional training whilst they were peer supporters. They also had very, very good support from a service facilitator, Dave Bell, who actually had monthly meetings with everybody. And then every time any peer supporter had a session, he was on the telephone to them, giving them support. A little bit quickly about how we did the study. We did a typical kind of study in the social sciences. It was a qualitative study with semi-structured interviews. So we knew some of the questions we wanted to ask, and we used a topic guide, which allows you to kind of guide people, but it leaves space for them to answer in their own words and to bring up things that are important to them. We transcribed the interviews, and then we did what's called thematic analysis, which is just probably one of the simplest kind of analysis. But you basically look for recurrent themes in the data. We had 9 carers in the study. That was 8 females, 1 male. About the average age was 64. The volunteers were similar age, 66 on average, and they were all female. We had 1 male volunteer on the team at the time, but we could never find anybody for him to support. And I don't quite know what happened, but unfortunately we couldn't interview him because he hadn't actually had a chance to do anything. So what did we find? Well, there were 3 main sort of sections to the findings, the themes. One was the benefits for both carers and volunteers. And this was really striking. We were kind of looking more for benefits for carers, but actually there were some things that were common to both carers and volunteers. And this was something about not being alone. There was something about emotional support and release and having fun, enjoyment. Then something about this relationship between the volunteer and the carer. And then finally a bit about the limitations and challenges of peer support. So I'll just give you a bit more detail. And what I've got is anonymized quotes, so the names are made up. I've just sort of identified them as either a carer or a volunteer. So throughout the data, we kept getting this sense for both carers and the volunteers that being not alone was absolutely crucial. It was something about being not alone in their experiences, but also their emotions, their anger and their unsatisfactions, and this kind of emotional journey they'd been on. And a lot of the carers particularly talked about saying this process had made them realize they were normal, that other people got angry, other people had difficult emotions, and other people were also in actually quite difficult situations. And they said it took away the kind of why me thing. They realized there were other people like that. So this Beatrice, the carer, said, it's a perfectly normal, understandable reaction, that no one's weird or freaky that they feel like that. There was anger in there too, but having someone say, yeah, I felt like that too, helped. Whereas a volunteer said she had felt before she started being a volunteer, I was isolated with the situation. It taught me that lots of people are experiencing other aspects of the same thing. there was a lot of discussion about emotional support and release. So what was really important was talking to someone that the carers felt understood what they were going through. And interestingly, they often said things like, we talk about her feelings, that's the volunteer, and my feelings, and how it affects me, and how it feels like a living bereavement. And what was very important too in the training, the volunteers shared experiences a lot, but also during the process of volunteering. So it released you. Talking to someone, it emotionally strengthens you. Suddenly you're letting out things that you've kept in for many years in some cases. It was good. So from the emotional point of view, we helped each other. The other thing, which again we sort of forget, was the amount of enjoyment. People look forward to these sessions. They talked a lot about the fun, the laughter, the jokes. They talked about the opportunities to talk about things outside caring and not just having to talk about being a carer and the difficulties that they were experienced. They talked about reduced social isolation and meeting new people. So this, Deborah said, it's about chatting, having a laugh, which I hardly ever get. So only an hour a week, but she was having that. And the volunteer kind of agreed it's something to look forward to. You can have a conversation with somebody maybe you haven't had a chance to have many conversations recently. It breaks the monotony and it gives you contact with the outside world. There were some things that specifically benefited carers. So they learnt new skills, they learnt how to cope. A lot of them felt much more confident about facing the future. The service was actually called Facing the Future. One of the things they were trying to do was help people look ahead, not too far, but to look ahead. So Henrietta, carer, said she was able to show me that it's different for everybody, that there is no perfect solution. Try something. If it doesn't work, you try something else. She could give me constructive suggestions about possible ways of approaching a problem. And then the carer said, you realise you're doing good, because I think you can feel a bit negative about things and whether you're doing enough, but you can only do so much. Volunteers talked about emotional rewards. They talked about transferable, valuable skills. A lot of them talked about having, which was mentioned earlier in another presentation, carers feeling they'd had so much, they'd learnt so much, and they wanted to use that experience. And they said this was a perfect opportunity. And she said it's not just satisfaction, but when you see somebody you're mentoring becoming stronger and able to cope, you feel you've done something worthwhile. One thing that came up very strongly in this was actually the importance of being a former carer, and it seemed to be something about trust, about knowing that the other person wasn't going to judge you because they had been through something similar. So although the circumstances are very different, the emotional journey is very similar. And this carer talked about, she understands, her husband had Alzheimer's as well. So anything I wanted to say to her, she said, I know because I've done it. I know what it's like. I've been through that. And I think the other thing that came out really strongly for us was the complementary nature of... Okay, nearly there. The complementary nature of peer support with other things. So it provides something which the informal family support can't give you. And it also is something professionals can't give you. So it kind of falls in between the two, and it's actually really important. So people talked a lot about not wanting to burden their families, for example. Just a couple more. Very few negatives were highlighted, but carers and volunteers did talk about the emotional stress for volunteers, about reliving difficult experiences. One or two carers said, my situation's really tough, and actually an hour a week's fine, I enjoy it, but it's never going to really change how I feel. And volunteers talked about sort of reflecting on why they'd decided to take on this role and whether there were reasons that were actually very good. And also the relationship was meant to end, and people found that very, very hard. So very finally, I think what really came out of this is the benefits for both volunteers and carers, and some of the benefits overlap. This thing about being not alone is really important, and for many of these volunteers, it was only years after they'd stopped looking after someone they realised this was true. These former carers actually can do an awful lot, and they really enjoyed it. And it may help something to do with the stigma of carers, of dementia. If people understand how many other people are going through this, it may just help more carers coming forward for support in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nan, for the well-structured presentation. And are there any questions from the audience? Gentlemen?
I'm James Sinclair from University College London. We recently ran an RCT where we were matching up volunteer peer supporters with family cares for people with dementia. And we're now looking at the impact of that on the volunteers themselves.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
And what we found was that volunteers were extremely psychologically well at the start of volunteering and extremely psychologically well at the end. And actually there was no decrease in wellness, no affection, anxiety, depression, or anything like that. But what we did find was a slight decrease in their feelings of personal growth and autonomy. And I was just wondering if there's anything that you came across on your side that might suggest.
No, not at all. I mean, personal growth, definitely people talked about greater, growing by this process. Autonomy is a really interesting one, actually. I don't know. It didn't really emerge at all, but you would think, wouldn't you, that it would enhance autonomy because of the choices you're making and all the things you're doing. So it's interesting.
Yeah, well, our only suggestion on that was that autonomy might be affected negatively. So it's actually taking back to sort of a slight enactment of the carer role, again, of their previous carer role, but also in a slightly different way, but still caring for someone else.
Yeah.
So that was.
Yes, I don't know. And this group had fantastic support from the Admiral nurse that was working with them, who did these. They had these fantastic monthly sessions together where they talked, and they went, as you would in clinical supervision, and that in itself was a great social meeting for them, and they became great friends. I mean, that was the problem. This was meant to be time limited, and they became friends with each other and with the people they were supporting, which they weren't meant to. But